Daniel here for Tabletop for One, and my first impressions after 4 plays of 20 strong Solar Sentinels. And I thank you for joining me today. Now, 20 Strong is designed by Josh Carlson, Salem Scott, and Shannon Wedge, and it is published by Chip Theory Games, and I backed this game on GameFound, and this is actually the first game from Chip Theory that I've purchased and played. Now, in 20 Strong, at the heart of it is a dice management game where you are encountering different enemies or encounters, rolling dice, allocating them, and trying to make your way through the deck to the point of being able to fight a boss, defeating the boss, and winning the game. In Solar Sentinels, you play as Sentinels that are fighting an oncoming alien horde, and so you are fighting through these 3 decks of cards trying to fight to the end boss and defeat that boss. Now, I do want to note that this first impressions is only for the Solar Sentinels because the Solar Sentinels comes with the base game, and the other expansions are just that, expansions. And so I'm only giving impressions on the base game. I don't generally do first impressions on expansions. So just bear that in mind. This is only for the Solar Sentinels, this 20 strong base game. Now, I do want to talk about the production quality for a moment. I happen to love the fact that they are PVC cards, which means I don't have to sleeve them if I'm worried about damage. Of course, with my arthritic hands, I will probably sleeve them anyways to make it easier to shuffle, but the cards are fantastically crafted and they look great. The art is sometimes hard to distinguish what it is you're looking at, but it's still some really interesting art to look at. The graphic design works really well. The font is slightly small, but there's a lot that needs to be put on each card, so I kind of understand that. But I have a couple of issues with the production quality, and that's mainly the dice. See, the dice are like these glitter type translucent dice or opaque dice, and they have these big glitter chunks in the dice. And unfortunately, some of those glitter chunks are near the surface and actually, impair your vision on what you're looking at on that dice face. And so I have a few of those dice, the yellow dice I showed in my playthrough, where those glitter chunks, they're big pieces that are right there at the surface. It almost feel like it's gonna fall apart or something or chip off. And unfortunately, it impairs my vision because I have difficulty differentiating objects on a table. That's just my own personal thing. And unfortunately as well, one of my boxes was crushed or something, but this whole corner is ripped open. There's actually a hole here, and that is unfortunate as well. I'm not looking to get a replacement. It's just something you need to watch out for. Apparently the dice issue is with a lot of people. So definitely check out that or consider waiting for a second printing, and hopefully they will have ironed out those issues. But now let's talk about the gameplay. So like I said before, the core of the gameplay is dice management. See, you start out with 17 dice, and what you do is you choose an enemy or an event to engage. You activate the enemy, bringing it into the active area, and then you decide how many dice you're gonna roll to try and defeat the enemy. And so you can choose, 1, 2, 10 dice if you want, all 17 if you want. Now, each of the dice come in different color, and they are weaker depending on the color. And on the dice themselves, they have a little circle that shows pips on the center. And so depending on how many pips there are, that's how many hits you can possibly get on that die. That's how many hit faces there are. So the yellow ones only have 2 hit faces, the rest are misses, whereas the red one has 6 hits all around. And each of the dice has 1 critical hit on one of those hit faces. And the critical hits just do an extra damage. And so you have this interesting puzzle of deciding how many dice to allocate, because after you're done with your action, you're going to exhaust all those dice. You'll set them aside and you won't recover all of them necessarily right away. You have a recovery stat for your character and you're able to recover dice after each encounter, but it's not a lot. The particular character I played in playthrough only recovered 1 die per turn. Now that can increase over time due to extra abilities that you get for defeating enemies, but at the beginning you start off with not recovering a lot. So if you spend 5 dice, you're only recovering 1. But that's where it comes into this puzzle, because each of the enemies provides a bonus or an ongoing ability or a single-use item that you can use. And your heroes come with a passive bonus that triggers when certain conditions are met. And so you're able to kind of puzzle out, all right, if I attack this enemy, use this many dice, then I'll be able to use this item, which will recover some dice and trigger my hero's ability, which might help me recover some health, and so on. So you have this really interesting puzzle of when to encounter enemies, On top of that, you have to watch out for some enemies bring along friends. So you can encounter more enemies than you expect and have to roll more dice to defeat them. So you really have to puzzle out when you're gonna, do big encounters and how you're gonna manage your dice, recovering enough over time. And I would have to say that that is the meat of the game. Now, there's some other things to note. Some of the enemies have ongoing effects during the battle, which change how you encounter the enemy. Sometimes they only let you roll so many dice. Sometimes they negate damage for certain colors. Sometimes, they have different conditions on how you can apply dice to the enemy and do damage. And so that provides another interesting puzzle, especially if an enemy brings along some friends, because their ongoing effects can stack with the others, and it can have some really interesting, layouts for that battle. Now, the goal of Solar Sentinels is to get through at least one deck of the 3 decks of enemy cards, and then you're able to encounter the boss if you wish, although you can wait until you get through all 3 decks and then encounter the boss immediately. And so you kind of have to, plan that out, making sure you have enough dice ready for when you encounter the boss. And then the boss fight is pretty straightforward. It's just a very difficult enemy to defeat. Usually has like around 9 hit points or so, whereas other enemies have 6 or less generally. And when you encounter the boss, it can bring along friends. It has ongoing effects. Some bosses require the enemies to be defeated first. Some others require certain colors to hit and that sort of thing. So the boss provides their own puzzle challenge. Now, let's talk about replayability. In the box itself with Solar Sentinels, you have 4 bosses and a total of 6 characters. Now, the character abilities are different enough to where it feels like a different puzzle due to their ongoing effects. And so that's where the great replayability comes from. The bosses themselves don't provide much replayability because you actually might see all the boss cards by card effects that allow you to reveal the boss and discard it and draw a new one instead. And so you might see all those during one playthrough. On top of that, you're likely going to see every single enemy in one playthrough because you go through at least one pile of cards, but chances are you're going to go through most of those cards and see all the enemies. So there's not a lot of content in this to explore other than maybe changing up the heroes. Now, there are different difficulty levels and these things called missions, which I didn't show in the playthrough itself. I did in the tutorial part of it. But missions, basically, they add different conditions that you have to meet or else the boss fight is harder in the end. And while those missions are cool as they add an added layer to the puzzle, it's not much towards the replayability. And so that's where it comes in with the difficulty is the difficulty. You can start at rank 1 and try to work your way up to rank 6. And what that does is it requires you to banish dice or exhaust dice early, at the start of the game, as well as draw extra missions. But it doesn't change the gameplay much at all. So I'd have to say, after 4 plays now, I've seen just about everything I can see in Solar Sentinels. Now, as far as ease of solo play, this game is fairly easy to learn if you only have the Solar Sentinels. See, the problem is you have a general rulebook, and then you have a rulebook that modifies the general rulebook for each of the different kinds of decks. So if you play, the Too Many Bones ones, it's going to have different scenario rules for the Too Many Bones. If you play the Hoplomachus Victorum one, it's going to have different rules for that modify the general rules. Now, most of the general rules are always in play for each of the different types of decks, but it just realized that you have 2 different rulebooks that you have to use to play the game. And now, the ones in Solar Sentinel, the extra rules aren't that hard to add on. You have some mandatory enemies, an extra discard step that you do, and a couple other things. So there's not a lot there that adds on to it, and thankfully, there's not a lot of rules in the game. There are quite a few terms that you have to learn, but they're very well explained in the rulebook, and after a play or 2, you've got it. You don't really even need to look at the rulebook anymore. All right, so with all that said, what do I actually think of this game? Now, here's the thing. I think this would be a good game if I hadn't played other games like this. See, this game reminds me of One Deck Dungeon with the dice allocation there, or One Deck Galaxy. It also reminds me of Super Hot with the mission setup and, having to complete the missions. It reminds me of other games that do those mechanics better. That's the thing. The fact is that I don't feel like I'm seeing anything new. Now, the way you allocate dice and exhaust them and recover them, that's a little different than some of the other games I've played, but there's not enough there for me to say, wow. I mean, it's okay. It's an okay game. And I think part of the problem with that is Solar Sentinels is not a very deep game in of itself. So Solar Sentinels deck, as you get to see the majority of content in your first play, it really doesn't seem like that deep of a game. Now I hear that the Too Many Bones and the Hoplomachus Victorum expansions do add more to it and give you a whole different kind of puzzle to play and that sort of thing. But here's the thing. A lot of you are buying the base game only, and I'm sorry, but you shouldn't have to buy an expansion to make the game better, right? Well, at least that's my thought in it. And so there you have it. That was my first impressions after 4 plays of 20 Strong Solar Sentinels by Josh Carlson, Salem Scott, and Shannon Wedge, and published by Chip Theory Games. You'll have to let me know in the comments below what you thought of this game. Please also like it and subscribe to this channel if you like the content you see here, and I thank you very much for joining me on Tabletop for One. Have a great night.